autonomous research institute within the UN system, doing policy-relevant, cutting-edge research on social development, in particular, how to mainstream social policy in development discourse and practices. This plenary session's title is Rethinking Social Policy. There are complex mixtures of problems and opportunities within social policy studies, and we find so many limitations and challenges in social policies designed and implemented at various levels of governance. How should we address them? I don't have answers, so we invited 5 excellent speakers who would help us to find answers. I don't think we need a long introduction for these speakers, but here we go. Firstly, we have Chochi Chikata. Chochi is research professor of development sociology and has been the director of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana since August 2016. Before this, she was deputy director of the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, or ISSER, and director of the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy at the University of Ghana. And more importantly, she was a board member of UNRIST, and she's going to talk about today gender, social reproduction, and social policy. And we have Jimmy Adesina, who is professor and the Sachi Chair in Social Policy at the College of Graduate Studies, University of South Africa. And Jimmy was also a board member of UNRIST. Jimmy is going to talk about rethinking social policy with Thandika Makandawire. And we have 2 speakers for one paper, Maureen McIntosh and Tao Shikida. Maureen is professor of economics at the Open University in London. Her specialization covers economics of public services and social sector markets and development economics. Maureen was the external research coordinator for 2 UNRIST projects. They are commercialization of healthcare, global and local dynamics and policy responses, and globalization, inequality, and healthcare. And we have Tausi Kida, and Tausi Kida is a Tanzanian development economist. She holds a doctorate from the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University, Netherlands. Since 2015, she has been executive director of the Economic and Social Research Foundation, a nonprofit independent Tanzanian research and policy think tank in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And they are going to talk about commercialization, gender, and ethics in Tanzanian healthcare, honoring the work of Pauletti Bandibagi. And last but not least, we have Kate Meager. And Kate is Associate Professor in Development Studies, London School of Economics. She published numerous articles, books, and book chapters which provide hindsights and insights which help us to forecast the future. I found one of her articles particularly notable in this conference context, and it is her article in the journal Development and Change entitled Reflections of an Engaged Economist, an interview with Thandika Makandawire, published in January 2019. Today, she will talk about transforming African informal economies, looking back to move forward in the wake of COVID-19. Before you move to the presentation, here are some housekeeping matters. Firstly, this session is recorded, and if you have any problem with this recording, please contact the organizer. And please leave your comments and questions in the chat box, and we will deal with them in the Q&A session after the presentation. Then, without further ado, we will go for our first speaker, Chochi. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilcheon, for that introduction. And just a small correction, I've never served on the board of UNRIST. I was an active participant in UNRIST's work in a certain period. Thank you. But thank you, and I'm really pleased to be on this panel among old friends that I have great respect for, whose work has inspired me. I want to share my screen. It doesn't look like you can see my screen. Okay, let me stop sharing. Just a minute. Okay. Sorry about that, but it's here now. So the title of my presentation is Deepening Gender Equity in Transformative Social Policy, the Developmental State and Social Reproduction. In this presentation, I will speak in 4 parts. There'll be a preamble, there'll be a section called What is the Gender Problem in Social Policy? And there will be a discussion on social reproduction and a last reflection on what needs to be done. Thandika Kandawere's prodigious scholarship offered a radical critique of the dominant social protection agenda that has been integral to economic liberalization. This, together with his work on social equality and development, which is an extension of a strand of his thinking on development states in Africa, has acquired a new agency in discussions about rebuilding Africa beyond COVID-19. In this presentation, I want to bring that work into conversation with an increasingly influential strand of feminist theorizing on social reproduction as a way to deepen attention for the need for an agenda of for an agenda of transformative social policy to have a gender equality and equity content as one of its pillars. I think this is a way of honoring Thandika's legacy. I first met him at a seminal conference CODESRA organized in 1991 on engendering African social sciences, which culminated in an edited book and also laid the foundations for a raft of measures and efforts to promote attention to gender and feminist scholarship within CODESRA and to create an enabling environment for women scholars to become active participants at all levels of CODESRA. While this is still work in progress, it has become part of CODESRA's DNA. Thandika, as executive secretary, participated fully in this conference, famously expressing skepticism about the possibility of a credible body of scholarship on gender and women's studies, and even famously recanting by the end of the conference. While Thandika himself was not a scholar in the tradition of feminist studies, he championed and gave invaluable strategic support to this work, to its practitioners, first at CODESRA and then at UNRIS, where he presided over one of the most fertile periods of feminist scholarship under the leadership of Shah Razavi. Again, that work continues to be a part of UNRIS DNA till this day. In this presentation, I reflect on the gender deficits of early post-colonial and current approaches to social policy, discuss the key elements of the concept of social reproduction and its implications for the analysis of the gender deficits of social policy, and offer some reflections on the reform of social policy. My main argument basically is that all the constitutive functions of social policy are gendered processes, and the concepts of social reproduction, as theorized and applied in the feminist political economy literature, is useful for undergirding the work on gender equitable and transformative social policy. In particular, its preoccupations such as the recentering of non-market relations and activities implicated in the reproduction of workers can be applied in rethinking social policy for economies and societies that are largely agrarian, with large segments of subsistence production and dominated by informality. So what is the problem? What's the gender problem in social policy? Even at its most expansive, in the early post-colonial period, social policy did not prioritize social reproduction or gender equality. The productivist logic and the modernization ideology at the heart of social policy failed to appreciate the reproductive subsidies enjoyed by market production within extroverted capitalism and the intersecting class, gender, generational, regional, and rural-urban inequalities that had become entrenched as a result. As Nkandawire pointed out in his second lecture on social equality and development at the Agri-Fraser Gaggisberg lectures in 2013, economic development is an extremely dislocative process, generating what the Germans have called the social question. Citing Amartya Sen, he noted that social justice is not only a basic constituent of development in itself, but also an important instrument for its achievement, and therefore both the means and an end, and an issue of political economy of the highest order. Recalling the history of European welfare states, he noted the various policies that were introduced to address the social questions that the new economic transformation of the Industrial Revolution had posed, addressed four basic challenges. And we now know all of these in quite a bit of detail. It was first and foremost to ensure the reproduction of society threatened by new diseases that accompanied urbanization and congested housing. Second, to enhance citizens' capabilities as key players in economic production and the alleviation of poverty through education and training. Third, to capacitate citizens to respond to the exigencies of change through the provision of workplace accident insurance and pensions in old age. And fourth, and finally, to ensure redistribution and to guarantee an equitable process of change. If we discuss the post-colonial states' social policies on the basis of the four challenges and the fifth proposed by Adeshina, social cohesion, we begin to see the achievements and limitations of the post-colonial social policy before the neoliberal revolution. First, we need to reckon with the fact that the economies that were inherited were largely agrarian and dominated by self-employment and remnants of forced labor, casual wage work, and migrant labor. Close to 6 decades after independence, African economies are facing failed agrarian transitions, demographic pressures, and more extensive informalization of work. Feminist scholars have long pointed out the uneasy relationship between the anti-colonial movements and women. The writings of Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, and Samora Machel drew attention to this problem in underlining the important role of women and the necessity of their emancipation. Amilcar Cabral was famously to note that in Guinea, we say we are fighting two colonialisms, one of the Portuguese and the other of men. Samora Machel made his own contribution to this literature on the woman question when he wrote, "The emancipation of women is not an act of charity, the result of a humanitarian or compassionate attitude. It is a fundamental necessity for the revolution, the guarantee of its continuity, and the precondition for its victory. The main objective of the revolution is to destroy the system of exploitation and build a new society which releases the potential of human beings, reconciling them with labor and with nature. This is the context in which the question of women's emancipation arises," end of quote. In spite of progressive social policies after independence, including for the Nkrumah regime, universal education policies, and the first experiments with affirmative action in the economic and political spheres, the agenda of gender equality and equity was always a struggle, with progress constantly disorganized by the strong undertow of patriarchal ideologies, institutions, and resistance. This was no surprise, as the anti-colonial struggle took place in societies in which gender inequalities were entrenched. Even within the most progressive liberation movements, gender-based violence and discrimination were serious issues, and often liberation leaders were seen as progressive in public and reactionary at home. On the social question, Nkandawire argues that this has been long on the African agenda, manifested at different stages in the resistance to slavery, colonization, and the struggle for political liberation. Although the manifestos of nationalist movements were replete with promises of unity, economic development, and social equality, once independence was achieved, these promises were not realized, and instead, new forms of injustice driven by class, ethnicity, and gender came to the fore. Nkandawire argues that three factors militated against social equality. The first was the focus on the national question and nation building, and this was manifested in deracialization and indigenization of key positions of privilege and power, resulting in a rapid growth of inequality among Africans themselves. Secondly, policymakers embraced linear views of history, which posited that social equality could only be achieved at a much higher level of development and under conditions of industrialization, where non-state welfare arrangements had been eroded. The third factor was the framing of the development agenda itself as either a trade-off or a sequencing act between development and social equality. Nowhere in this analysis did gender inequalities find serious consideration. If they were considered at all, women were seen as unproductive, subjects whose claims to welfare were justified by their motherhood and their inability to survive the vagaries of market economies. While this shifted very quickly to concerns about their productive capacities in the late 80s and early 70s, questions of reproduction, redistribution were never on the table. This was the heyday of the liberal feminist guard paradigm, which came to dominate social policy agendas and continues to be the main approach of development projects interventions directed at women. Fast forward to the neoliberal era and the current dominance of social protection measures, the cash transfers, fees, exemptions for pregnant women, and credit programs. It's noteworthy that these measures have supported the welfare of women and other social groups facing existential challenges. The main challenges of social policy in this period are well rehearsed, and time doesn't allow me to pursue these, except to point out that their narrow poverty-centric remit is not up to the task of positioning social policy as an emancipatory force and a catalyst for structural transformation and equitable development. In relation to women living in poverty, gender equality is assumed to flow from welfare social policy interventions. In practice, social protection measures, as well as the broader guard paradigms in which they are situated, have reinforced or ignored gender inequalities because they are founded on Eurocentric male breadwinner and female housewife models of the family and household. The conditionalities for access to social protection measures often require that women assume normative expectations of filial, maternal, and marital piety, selflessness and hard work, accept extra responsibilities, group work, and intrusive institutional policing. Very few measures address the questions of women having predominant responsibility for reproductive work. The policies also fail to follow key aspects of gender inequality, including the gender segmentation of work, the gender pay gap, and the gender assets gap. There's also inadequate attention to gender-based physical and psychological violence, and also a failure to reform social policy institutions, which are either paternalistic or an integral part of the problem. Examples being marriage, land tenure, inheritance, and labor issues. Given that social policy is not just about measures, but also about institutions and social relations, these are critical gender deficits of social policy. And while we may decry the neglect of the question of reproduction in social policy, certain approaches to these matters may actually reinforce gender inequalities. So on social reproduction, the concept of social reproduction, at least conceptually, unites production and reproduction, and holds the promise of social policies that successfully tackle both production and reproduction, as well as questions of redistribution. The starting point of the theorizing of social reproduction is the integral links between production and reproduction. As Gita Sen notes, women are at the crossroads between production and reproduction,
between economic activity and the care of human beings, and between economic growth and human development. Women are workers in both spheres, and also the ones with the most at stake, those who suffer the most when the two spheres meet at cross purposes, end of quote. In analyzing social reproduction, feminists have taken as their point of departure Marxist terminology of social reproduction, which refers to the reproduction of the capitalist system as a whole. Feminist social reproduction theories have defined social reproduction as follows: the activities and attitudes, behaviors and emotions and responsibilities and relationships directly involved in maintaining life daily and intergenerationally. It involves various kinds of socially necessary work, mental, physical, and emotional, aimed at providing the historically and socially as well as biologically defined means for maintaining and reproducing population. Among other things, social reproduction includes how food, clothing, and shelter are made available for immediate consumption, and how the maintenance and socialization of children is accomplished, how care of the elderly and the infirm is provided, and how sexuality is socially constructed. End of quote. But Achaya argues for an approach that analyzes production and reproduction within a unitary framework. As Vogel points out, this is a tall order, although worth the trouble. This new work on social reproduction builds on an earlier tradition of work by Maramis, the subordination of women's collective, and their seminal work of Marriage and the Market. Our own Maureen on this platform, on this panel, contributed to this effort. And then also later work by UNRIS, done by Razavi and Budlenda, work by Naila, Kabir, and others, who have argued for a critical place for non-market relations and transactions in both production and reproduction in capitalist society, drawing close attention to the reliance on semi-proletarianized households that derive a significant source of sustenance from self-provisioning, informal reciprocity, state transfers, and consume a significant proportion of goods and services outside the purview of the market. This analysis highlights the importance of subsistence and the domestic sector and the care economies, which are critical for both Fordism and neoliberalism, as well as key actors such as women of all ages, the agrarian household, and the informal worker. They also demonstrate that aspects of reproductive work may become part of the public arena of the state and the market during industrialization. For example, healthcare, the socialization of children, family planning services, and childcare. In poorer countries, though, these activities still are mostly carried out on an unpaid basis in the household, and social reproduction is thus an indispensable background condition for the possibility of capitalist production. And the split between productive and reproductive labor that has underpinned forms of women's subordination under modern capitalism. Even more importantly, it has gone hand in hand with the massive recruitment of women into low-wage service work. This leads me now to the last part of my presentation, which is about what is to be done about these questions. Firstly, it's very clear from the foregoing that we need a restatement and reframing of the social question. From a preoccupation with the productivity of workers, it should become a question of what policies will simultaneously promote the production and reproduction, as well as the redistribution, protection, and social cohesion in societies and economies that are largely agrarian, informal, with mostly self-employed persons, where work is gender segmented and results in substantive gender and other inequalities, to enable structural transformation in a gender equitable society. There's much to do, and time does not permit a detailing. Instead, I just want to draw attention to a number of measures. One is the reorganization of both the economic and social policy-making system to ensure coherence and synergies among the various policies and sectors, and a long-range view of social policy. Most importantly, this framework should clarify the goals of economic and social policies and how the various components will support the achievement of goals. The second is the recentering of questions of reproduction in social policy. This involves addressing the disadvantages of those who carry the burden of unpaid care and reproductive work. While aspects of social policy require the confrontation of power asymmetries in the workplace, at home, and in the wider society, this area of social policy has the added complication of raising difficult questions about the marriage contract and intra-household relations, and also has to address the lack of tools for valuing work that is not always recognized as work. This challenge is complicated by the widespread use of young, poorly paid domestic workers, mostly women, to support the execution of reproductive work. The unacceptable conditions of work in the absence of effective regulation creates an unstable working environment that is damaging for themselves and the care economy as a whole. 3 broad areas are required in this regard. The first is to prioritize and recenter and revalue reproductive and domestic work in any effort to reform work. This requires robust institutions and policies to remove institutional deficits, provide resources to finance those who do this work, whether as household members or as employees within and outside the household. Secondly, it's vital to champion and invest in the development and adoption of new reproductive technologies which reduce the drudgery of care. And third, to institutionalize the socialization of care and its equitable distribution by gender and class. Other reform areas would be the labor law and institutional reforms. We also need to reinvigorate informal workers' movements with new agendas and organizations. Another area of priority is the agrarian transition and agro-based industrialization, which includes land and labor reforms and the intensification of agriculture into a thriving agro-industrial sector with a more robust role for the state and a reduction in foreign involvement in agrarian policy making. We also need to look at the sustainable financing of social policy, reduce donor dependence, institute progressive taxes, special funds, and a range of domestic resource mobilization strategies, and also measures of cost effectiveness. Some of these are not new. They are gleaned from my own work and from different bodies of literature and work by other feminist scholars. They provide food for thought and also constitute a sort of research agenda that we can pursue. In conclusion, I've been arguing that the concept of social reproduction, in conversation with the critique of the social equality deficits of the developmental state, provide an important space to deepen the consideration of gender equality and equity in the work on transformative social policy. This is work in progress, and your thoughts are most welcome. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your excellent explanation about gender problems in social policy and gender solutions in social policy by providing what should be done by all of us. And let's go for our second speaker, Jimmy. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilchan. My presentation is, titled "Rethinking Social Policy" with Thandika Mkandawire. Thandika set out the premise of the social policy in development context research as follows. He argued that we wanted to examine the role of social policy where economic development was intentionally on the agenda. We also wanted to examine how social policy could be a transformative or developmental tool without compromising its intrinsic value. He reflected on the theorization of social policy in the global South, thick on description, very thin on explanation. And the project itself, reflected on what he called, the competing biases, the OECD bias in welfare regime literature, the tendency for that literature to have a linear view of history, at least, because even as at the time that Espen Andersen's work was published, the terrain had in fact already started moving. The static comparative approach, that tends to dominate the welfare regime literature, the wage labor bias and segmentation. On the other hand, in the developing countries and the development literature, there's what it calls the the developing countries' bias, and with very limited attention to the welfare literature. That itself is based, it derives likely from the notion that consumption, there's a trade-off between consumption and investment. The result of the project itself, of the research agenda, which is a global one, was the idea of transformative social policy. Both the project itself and personally, my own take on entry into the social policy literature in the 1990s was my disquiet with what I call the overinflation of the social protection instrument, largely income maintenance in the welfare regime literature. And then, of course, we then come to the post-1980s with the neoliberal diminution and retrenchment of social policy, which renders social policy largely as a residual instrument for addressing market failure. Now, in terms of the premise of the Transformative Social Policy project itself, I will argue that it invites us fidelity to a return to a wider vision of social policy, the wider vision of society, the notion of a good society, the mantra of better life for all, better life actually for all. It's against the background of George's presentation. A more expansive notion of human worth, broader instrument and diversity of instruments, the interconnection of economic and social policies, the articulation of social policy in the development context, rather than something that within the development literature used to be seen as something you do after after you developed. And then is to focus on the multiple levels, or what do we call the domains of transformation that is required. There's economic development and social institutions, social relations. In particular, here is the transformation of gender relations and gendered life, and the building of democratic society and policies, which changes the power dynamics in society. At the heart of it is the idea of the multitasking of social policy, rather than the monotasking that became the retreat into what social assistance. So that the idea, and Tandika emphasized this, of the multiple tasks and multiple roles pressed and simultaneously activated. And underpinning this, especially in the context in which there is the repurposing of the idea of development to become the relief of poverty, it's important, to return to the original idea of development, which is distinct from economic growth, and it combines self-sustaining growth with structural change in patterns of production, technological upgrading, social, political, and institutional modernization. And modernization understood here as continuous improvement in the way things are done and the way things are organized, and then the widespread improvement in human conditions. And this was as late as 2000 when Irma Adelman, pointed out again this. And here, Tandika's notion of development is much aligned with Adelman here, because he offered a vision of development that is grounded in what we call the Bandung spirit, which involves growth with structural transformation of economy and society, the mastery of technology, and strong manufacturing capacity. The structural transformation here requires a synergy with the mastery of technology with innovation and robust manufacturing. By what, as I said earlier, before, Osei Ocampo's broader notion of active production policies, with a focus on the dynamic efficiency of economic structures defined as their capacity to generate new waves of structural change. Now, Tandeka himself defines social policy as a collective intervention to affect social welfare, social institutions, and social relations directly. And he identified 4, but I've insisted on a 5th, tasks. He identified the concern of social policy as involving the redistributive effect of economic policy, because as Adelman demonstrated, left on its own, development process tends to redistribute income upwards rather than the notion of trickle down. So how do we deal with the redistributive effect of economic policy? It's also about protection of people from the vagaries of the market and the changing circumstances of life, the enhancement of the productive potential of members of society, and here, very crucially, the reconciliation of the burden of reproduction, what Georgia had been talking about earlier on, with that of other social tasks. I've argued that in fact enhancing social cohesion, and in the old nationalist discourse, what we call the nation building project, is a crucial, important task of social policy, not just in Africa, but in other parts of the world. Gunnar Milda, famously made the idea that the discovered cohesion was not something within the Swedish system that was intentionally planned in the 30s and the 40s, but it was something that emerged as a result of the nature of social policy, and I'll come back and reflect on the particular instrument in the African context in which for enhancement of social cohesion. So in this particular way, we understand the task of social policy, extending Tandeka's discourse. Not that Tandeka was unaware or of the social cohesion role of social policy, but he defined this lightly in terms of 4 tasks. I indicate the 5th task. Now, further into the specification of the idea of transformative social policy here is the normative framing, and I will argue that a distinct component of it is in the normative framing of equality, underpinned, social policy system underpinned by equality and solidarity. And we have here the 5 tasks. Most crucially, the diversity of policy instruments. And the point here is each of these can be specifically constructed in a way that advances different dimensions of equality, gender, ethnic, religious, and so on in society. So we look at education as a key, very dynamic dimension of social policy, instrument of social policy, health, human settlement and housing, and agrarian reform. And agrarian reform is particularly important, which is often neglected in essentially the largely OECD literature. But a major research project that we launched at the chair a few years ago, which has produced about 4 PhD students and generated a number of publications, is in fact focusing on the social policy dimension of land and agrarian reform. And I think one of the presentations yesterday demonstrated, that the production enhancement, production, activation and support for farmers have implications for the protection function of task of social policy. It definitely has implications for the redistributive task of social policy and the production task of social policy. As some of the outcome of that project demonstrated a major deficit, especially in the A1 farming, is the social reproduction component of it. But we also then look at, think of labor market policies, especially active labor market policy, as a vital component of, vital component of social policy, and as a social policy instrument. Equity and affirmative action, family, child policy, care policy, old age, social insurance, and fiscal instruments, that can be used to stimulate production, to deepen protection, to reconcile, burden of social reproduction, and to be redistributive, as well as create, environment for social cohesion. All these will have different development outcomes, economic, social, political, and so on. Grounded in the norms of equality and solidarity, it has a look-back effect in deepening, and cementing the norms of equality and poverty, equality, solidarity. But what is important to keep in mind is that the relationship between social policy and economic policy, for instance, is not a one-way traffic and descent. And we've seen particular examples of where social funds have become source of development financing. In particular here, we think in terms of mobilization of pension funds for development purposes. Finland, for instance, use of pension fund for infrastructure development, industrialization, and housing. Korea's, use of pension funds for building, targeted industries and infrastructure, and the use of provident fund in Singapore, for housing. We also see the way in which you can design your education policies, not simply about, advancing gender equity, building the productive capacity of society, but also the way in which it can be designed so that it enhances, social cohesion, and addresses the fissures of ethnic fragmentation in many of our countries. And this becomes quite important especially in post-conflict situations where social policy can be a vital mechanism for addressing the underlying factors for social fragmentation. And here we reflect on the specific cases in Tanzania, where secondary school children were moved from the south to schools and live in the north and live with communities. And the whole idea here was about developing a Tanzanian national identity between accretion to ethnic identity. In the Nigerian context, it was the issue of unity schools, which was in response to the civil war. And the idea was to have an admission policy that brings students together from different parts of the country and this and that. And I remember quite, Raufu Mustafa telling me once, "Oh, if there's a problem, I know who to call." And I said, "Why?" He said, "No, but we all went to school together, and so on and so forth." And this is just an example of the way in which a social policy instrument can be designed to have a transformative impact. But what is important here is the idea of social policy architecture, the need to focus on interconnectedness of diverse social policy instruments, the need to focus on the normative underpinning of the architecture, and the degree of synergistic connection between economic and social policy. You cannot have an economic policy that is about the pursuit of selfish interest and then look for a social policy that is about solidarity. It doesn't work. So economic and social policy have to have shared normative premise, and the coherence in the normative framing and the instruments becomes quite vital, because social policy design is not like shopping in a supermarket where you can get, bits and pieces of this and this. It leads to incoherence, And finally here is to think of transformative social policy as a conceptual device as well as an evaluative device. As a device for thinking about social policy in terms of the multitasking of social policy, the diversity of the instruments, and which is the basis for the critique of current diminution of social policy and the monotasking and reduction of social policy to social assistance. The focus on the ideational normative framing of social policy, the focus on structural transformation and concern with the structural underpinnings of vulnerability. And as Alva and Gunnar Milda will argue, a pursuit of prophylactic social policy that is concerned with preventing people, falling into poverty and so on and so forth, rather than having to attend to it, afterwards and this, and the issue of the coherence of the architecture as a policy, as an evaluative device. Transformative social policy gives us a handle on evaluation of social policy framing and normative underpinning. And this is a key dimension of the thing. It's not enough to say you're giving money to people. The normative underpinning of the instrument itself becomes quite important. An assessment of the instrument as part of a coherent tool, as a fragmented, process, and the problem with the social protection literature, which is actually social assistance literature, is this disconnected view, focusing on micro, of what is essentially, very basic, poor amount of money that's available to people. Why being blind, elective, blindness to the other dimensions of the economy and society. An assessment of social policy outcomes with emphasis here on the structural underpinning of this welfare and inequality. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimmy, for your excellent explanation about transformative social policy ideas and for the elaboration or development of idea, which includes social cohesion as a kind of major concern, one of the major concerns of social policy. I think if social policy is a collective intervention to respond to social questions, maybe we can think about other concerned areas like climate change or environment as well. So maybe we can discuss further at the Q&A sessions. Now we can go for our third speakers, Maureen and Tausi. So I hope you can wisely redistribute 20 minutes among yourselves. Okay, Maureen, Tausi, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that. And yes, we understand that this is 20 minutes, and we will, Tausi and I will do 10 minutes each and be very, we won't expand. This is a paper that was written collectively. It's called Commercialization, Gender and Ethics in Tanzanian Healthcare. And it's specifically written to honor a friend and colleague who has recently died much too young. It's written by three of us. The third author, Professor Mujinja, is also online, so can answer questions as well. I'm going to briefly present some early points. Tausi is then going to talk through an element of the research which she was deeply involved in designing and working on with Paula on, and then I'm going to conclude. We'll try to be tight. So this celebrates the work of Dr. Pauletti Bandibagi. She was an outstanding African scholar, social researcher, intellectual. She was also a close friend and colleague of all three of us. And she's someone whose work addressed many of the challenges within Thandika Mkandawiri's research program on social policy and development. In particular, she was an African researcher of international standing who, through a long research career, pioneered fieldwork, among many other things, pioneered fieldwork-based economic and social research on healthcare commercialization, on the growing commercialization of healthcare and its structure and consequences in Tanzania and more generally. And her central focus was on the issue of more equitable healthcare and social policy in general, and very particularly within this work on women and maternal care. And this paper looks, so there's a longer paper, explores her intellectual trajectory, in particular the ways she linked up charging and its emergence, economic and social organization of healthcare, and the important issues of ethics. And I was very struck by your comments, Jimmy, just now on normative framing, which I think you'll find this talk does refer to. Paula's work on commercialization of healthcare from the late 1990s, well, the mid 1990s in Tanzania, really helped to inspire a large 17-country project that our chair mentioned within the Social Policy and Development Programme, which was called Commercialization of Healthcare, Global and Local Dynamics and Policy Responses. It was a big project. It was largely written by developing country scholars on the basis of original research, and it looked at locally grounded and contextualized perspectives on the dynamics and impact of commercialization in healthcare and its scope for an experience of contestation. I was one of the leads for that project, and I drew very much for learning and work with Paula in the 1990s. Many of you will know that Tanzania in 1991 liberalized clinical practice in healthcare. It followed on from a really severe economic crisis, which had undermined public healthcare, had incentivized formal charging and very, very sharply reduced salaries. In 1993, it was followed by charging, the euphemism is user fees, introduced in public hospitals and, with exceptions, later in primary care. Paula, with Professor Mujinja, who's an paper author, and others, pioneered field investigation of that emerging private sector, the interaction of public and private charging, the viability of private facilities within this market, users' views on value for money, and much that's really still surprisingly innovative to this day. In the midst of this work, Paula noted very strongly how economic and health crises, including AIDS and including charging for basic services, have fallen most heavily on women consistently. Her early work emphasized healthcare's relational nature, field studies of the relationships of trust and understanding between providers and those seeking care, and the impoverishing implications of the breakdown of trust. Paula consistently explored the implications of the paid transactional nature of much emerging so-called mixed healthcare in African context for the constitution and breakdown of trust. And one consistent, innovative, and surprisingly controversial approach that Paula was consistently used in her work was to directly ask people, particularly women, as the predominant healthcare users, about their opinions on complex economic and ethical issues. An early example was ideas about value for money in healthcare. In the late 1990s, Paula asked respondents in over 100 households in 2 areas of Tanzania this question: patients seek treatment in different types of health facilities, public, private, and voluntary around here. Which type of facilities do you think gives the best value for money? And while health-seeking behavior is much researched, asking respondents for their assessment of value for money was not usual. And policymakers were inclined to feel that this wasn't likely to be productive. In fact, of course, all the women we asked, that Paula and the researchers asked, had no problem at all answering this question, belying the expectations of policymakers who viewed them as unable to answer that question. Paula drew out of her early work on commercialization some key research themes which she continued throughout her life. One was the exploration of how the widespread fee-for-service payment systems that were proliferating in private, religious, and at that time, most government facilities, except rural dispensaries, created opportunities and incentives for profiteering and mistrust. And she explored that in detail. She looked in detail from people's perceptions about how people sought to ensure that they received the service they had paid for, value for money, including looking for non-health related reasons for probity, genuine as opposed to just verbal religious vocation, for example, looking for a known staff member and simply paying more. She looked at the association of bribes with abuse. Tanzania's Tausi is going to say a little more about that in a moment. She became deeply interested in maternity care, which we're going to talk about further, as one of the important areas of healthcare where these issues were undermining quality, staff welfare, and trust, and looked at the importance of management culture. This is an issue I know Tausi is particularly interested in continuing to think about, especially the support or lack of it offered to lower level and predominantly female nursing staff. And now I'm going to hand over to Tausi to continue this discussion. I'll turn over Tausi, if you say next slide, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Maureen. And now I'll talk about research on ethics in maternal care. So Paula designed and led the Wellcome Trust research on maternal health in Tanzania. And in that, we did field work in one urban and one rural district. And we had interviews in 248 women and within 240 households. We did semi-structured and structured interviews. And we looked also into health workers and nurses and in about 59 healthcare facilities within these two districts. And within this work, next, Maureen, the idea was, first, there was limited studies that actually have elicited detailed understanding of ethical healthcare from participants in low, middle income country. And then how do we understand and define ethical care? So we invite women to provide their own experience and value-based definition of ethical care. And next, Maureen. And with this, we tried for women, nurses, and clinical officers, without prompting, to give their understanding, what do they consider to be ethical maternal care? And with that, we managed to come out with 5 key themes in these unprompted responses to these questions. And these are the areas that I would like to present this morning. One of the key themes that came out is empowered with emotion, respect, and caring, vis-a-vis humiliation and abuse in the understanding of ethical maternal care. We could see that predominantly responses referred to rudeness, abuse, humiliation, harassment, and respectful treatment without humiliation as part of a great component of ethical care. So the positive definition included politeness, kindness, caring, humanity, and love. So from the respondent, you could see that the maternal attendants should be fair, loving, kind, so that we feel at home, and they should be friendly, to be patient, and also closer to us. Women definition were thus embodied with emotions of anger, resentment, fear, and appreciation. One nurse, for instance, noted that to work ethically required you to be able to handle your emotion in a very stressful context of labor wards. Another area that came out is power and knowledge, that emphasis on teaching and listening. So about 30% of women that we interview in their definition being advised aspects of train, counsel, receiving explanation and information, and gaining understanding. So the aspect of to be listened and to be given appropriate treatment was very core, as in the, what is expected on ethical maternal care. So this theme identify a key source of vulnerability for women, their reliance on the knowledge and professionalism of staff for information, advice, and instruction, and the danger of not being listened. So nurses focus on their professional roles as educators and on the ethical importance of communication with women, listening and explaining. Another key area that came out is on ethics of contextual constraint, the supplies and staffing. So this was a third important theme, and it focused on contextual constraint on quality and access to care, shortages of supply, overworked staff, and fear of associated unethical behavior, such as selling supplies for personal gain. And also aspect of workload and skill problem appeared in about a third of our responses. So the maternity ward should have adequate staff. Imagine we have the following section, the labor ward, which has an antenatal unit, the postnatal care, which includes eclampsia and post-cesarean care, but in one shift, there are only 3 nurses to deal with all these sections. Is it possible to work ethically and effectively? So the question here was in the areas where there are severe shortages of supply and staffing, how are you expecting that ethical care can be provided? So that also came out as one of the key themes. And another one, the fourth one, is on charging, fairness, and ethics. As we all from Maureen's explanation, maternal health care was and it still is officially free of charge in Tanzania. So there was expectation that in places, especially in public facilities, where women will be able to receive free of charge care, this was seen as ethical. But in most cases, women are supposed and still are expected to bring some key supplies that will be required during the process. And also inequality between those who can't afford to bring the supplies and those who can. So it was seen that women saw fairness to those with less money as ethically important, that also they should receive proper treatment and care. So those who are wealthy should not be treated well and first, while those who are poor receive bad treatment. So inequality in provision of maternal health care. And lastly, Maureen, next one, is on empowerment of nurse, midwives, and the scope of management-led improvement. So in provision of ethical care, it was also seen the aspect of management and how that can actually lead and make a difference, even in hardship circumstances. One article compared 2 hospitals, for instance, systematically show how one, although experiencing a very severe financial constraint, paying low wages and facing often overwhelming workloads, and nevertheless achieve better, more respectful care than the other hospitals. So for patients, a sharp reputational difference included fear of requests for informal payment in one hospital, but not the other, linked to delay and abuse. And also for nurse midwives, key differences arose from management taking effective responsibility for ensuring supply, effective medical backup for nurses, zero toleration of bribery and abuse, better training, and there was a notably great sense of nurses that were respected by the management. So the article argued that even within very resource-constrained contexts, empowerment of nurses by management can reduce frustration and improve the experiences of both nurse midwives and women delivering in the hospital. So these are the 5 key themes that came out on our study on maternal and ethical care in Tanzania. Thank you, Maureen.
Thanks very much, Tausi. So just to finish up, I think we're still on time. I want to, this was very much a collective paper, and I want to just stand back from that summary of the findings and just reflect on some of the intellectual contributions to the social policy area. And in particular, I want to think about the issue of emotion and ethical judgments. In effect, if one looks at the public health ethics literature, as Paula and I did together when working on this, we realized that the focus of normative judgments on resource-constrained health systems have generally been rooted in ethical concern for social justice and human rights, which is really fine, but incomplete, I think. And what Paula's work did is it added some largely missing voices, as Taosi has noted, from low and middle-income country voices. The literature sometimes calls this empirically gathered lay intuition, in other words, listening to people, to support public health ethical reasoning. And there's an extraordinary lack of, women healthcare patients from low-income countries in this literature. And what was striking is that when we thought about and looked at the literature on the really strong elements of emotional and the way in which women linked emotions and ethics in their responses, we realized that this relates to a literature which in particular is reflected in Martha Nussbaum's work, where she looks at the cognitive evaluative understanding of emotions and the way that links to ethical judgments, and argues that, you don't have emotions on one side and ethics on the other, that these two things are properly linked. And women who had talked to us about their ethical understandings of maternal care and their notions of how vulnerability and dependence related to the way they were treated, really, they were offering ethical judgments that were, in Nussbaum's terms, both situational, a judgment on how oneself has been treated and whether that's ethical, and background, general beliefs that no woman should be humiliated at a moment of vulnerability as an ethical principle. So women's definitions emphasize dignity and care for the human person within conditions, as Taosi has been outlining, of well understood contextual constraint and inequalities. So what Paula argued in a talk to some philosophers at a meeting in London around this work, she argued, just 2 more slides, she argued that in the light of these findings, ethical dangers lay particularly within this healthcare in the scope for a downward spiral of abuse, stress, financial constraint, loss of dignity and care in maternity, a downward spiral of unethical care. And where care was said conversely to be ethical, it was described as successfully resisting all 3 pressures at once. That is, as kind, explanatory, and free from at least the link between informal charging and abuse. So her findings contested the separation and even opposition drawn in much of the public health ethics literature between arguments for social justice and arguments for beneficence towards individuals. And she really sought to bring those two together. So she argued, and I think this is a general contribution to the social policy literature, that the contextual crisis of resources and staffing, the lack of supplies and people and maternal care in these contexts is not only unethical for social justice reasons, it's also unethical because of its detrimental moral consequences in the deterioration of the relational and emotional aspects that are, in these women's view, central to ethical care. And I'm picking up in a way something that Jimmy just said about the importance of normativity. So final point. This is a personal reflection. In 2006, Paula and I wrote a commissioned paper, yet again for UNRIST, this time indeed commissioned by Shara Razavi on gender and health sector reform. We did the recommendations together, but this was very much a personal manifesto of Paula's, reflecting many of her concerns. And it went very briefly like this: that if you're doing health sector reform, then design it so that it does not increase the burden on poor women, nor women in general, that it promotes equality between male and female health workers, staff, and improves working conditions of lower level staff who are largely female. That reform should involve women equally with men, both as staff and citizens in the design. That it should not be a reform that increases work burden for women. This addresses very much Joji's point about unpaid work. and should try to reduce those burdens. It should build links between, this was one of Paula's central points, between reproductive health and other health needs of women in ways that reduce the strain for women of accessing holistic care. And there should be reforms outside the health sector, Joji's been talking about them, that strengthen women's rights and status, and so their ability to deal with the health sector. So what do we want to say as an end is that in Paula's memory, is that this mix of commitment to women's needs, analytical clarity, empirical rootedness, and ferocious focus on policy needs really typified the work of a committed intellectual and our very, very good friend, whom we've lost far too young.
Thank you very much, Tausia Maureen. I think it's very interesting kind of research. And, we often say that social policy is a political construct or social construct. The problem you have is we tend to pay attention to upstream dynamics and decision-making process. We ignore what is happening on the ground, especially those late intuitions, opinions. I think this research shows how to incorporate those downstream or on-the-ground dynamics and decision-making process can be, into the kind of social policy research and studies. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Kate as a last speaker. I hope Kate Meager could sort out her technical issues. Okay, Kate, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. And my apologies for, can you hear me?
Okay. Could you turn up volume a little bit, your microphone volume?
Okay.
Yeah, now it's okay. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. And I'm really delighted to be here despite train problems and technical problems. This paper that I'm presenting here was very much inspired in every way by Thandika. Although he didn't really work on the informal economy, he had a unique way of saying a few offhand things and suddenly opening your eyes to a whole new way of looking at things. And I initially wrote this paper for his 70th birthday conference in Malawi, which didn't take place. I rewrote it for a subsequent conference to celebrate his 70th birthday, but wasn't able to attend. So I have finally rewritten it and connected it with the issue of COVID in order to celebrate Thandika's work as everyone is doing here in this conference. I'm going to share some slides now. Hopefully my technical luck is better now. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, we could see that. Yeah, we could see that.
All right, so I'm really looking today at the issue of how the state shapes the informal economy and the informal economy in turn shapes the state, and looking at that as a way of interpreting a puzzle about the way Africa has related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And my presentation here is being done with the use of a variety of photographs drawing on the fair use policy of using publicly or internet photographs for educational purposes. So I'm starting here with a puzzle about the relationship between COVID and informality in Africa. Now, the COVID situation really focused attention on the informal economy as a source of extreme vulnerability. In particular, we saw the situation of how millions of migrants in India were extruded into the streets and forced to walk home because lockdowns ignored the fact that some people have to work every day in order to eat. Africa is known for having the largest share of informality in the world, but the lowest vulnerability to COVID. So the puzzle is, why is there an inverse relationship between informality and vulnerability to COVID in Africa if informality is supposed to make people extremely explicitly vulnerable to COVID? So this paper really, in exploring that puzzle, is challenging the lesson of the informal economy as a source of COVID vulnerability. And the idea that in the context of COVID and high informality, there's an urgent need to roll out basic social protection across Africa. My argument here is rather that we need to look more carefully at the relationship between COVID and informality, and to think more extensively about the need for a productivist rather than merely a residual protectivist approach to social policy. So in explaining the connection between informality and vulnerability to COVID-19, the inverse relationship, in fact, between these two, I'm drawing on 3 lessons from Thandika's work, particularly coming out in his paper on tax effort and colonial heritage, published in 2010. And in this paper, 3 of the key things that stood out to me were, 1, his emphasis in this paper and many of other elements of his work and wider research, the importance of a comparative approach among African countries within Africa, not just between Africa and the rest of the world. The second thing is the role of the state in shaping informal economies. And thirdly, the importance of policy solutions that are grounded in specific African realities. So I want to look here at how varied histories shaped varied informal economies within Africa, and how this relates to different types of state capacity, and the ways in which different kinds of informal economies and different levels of state capacity affect COVID measures, and what lessons this gives us for social policy. Now, just to show the inverse relationship that I'm talking about, this table shows the relationship between the size of the informal economy as a percent of the non-agricultural labor force and average COVID deaths per million. Now, I recognize that, that many people listening here and many people across the world have been touched by COVID, and I'm not trying to suggest that it's an insignificant disease by any stretch, but rather I want to emphasize 2 key issues by focusing on COVID deaths as an indicator. The first is that in a context in which testing is difficult, and in fact, having COVID is not necessarily a very dire thing, because many people have it and don't even know it, or are sick only for a short time. The problem is those who are vulnerable to COVID in an extreme way, and it leads to death. And also that death rates in a context of weak testing are much easier to identify, because there are alternative ways of determining death through excess deaths, et cetera. So the death records are more reliable as an indicator, and people's sense of what's happening in society. They notice if a lot of people are dying. They don't necessarily notice if a lot of people seem to be having COVID symptoms. So what I want to point out here is the broad inverse relationship between COVID and informality across the world by region. So Africa clearly here has the highest level of the largest informal economies at 72% of the non-agricultural labor force, rising to 77% of the non-agricultural labor force in sub-Saharan Africa. But the average COVID deaths per million as of the 26th of October of this year are just in the 200s, 260, 218 for sub-Saharan Africa. And then if you go down, the smaller the informal economies get, the larger the deaths per million get, up to 17% of the non-agricultural labor force working informally, but a death rate of 1,300 in high-income OECD countries. Now, if one zeroes in on African subregions, this inverse relationship is even more sharp. So it's interesting that Africa's death rate is very low, but it's even more interesting to look at the subregions within Africa and note that the inverse relationship between the size of the informal economy and the rate of COVID deaths still obtains. So Southern Africa and North Africa have the smallest informal economies in Africa for a variety of reasons, and Thandika's paper is very good at explaining that. I'll go into a little bit of that in a moment. But they have the highest death rates. Southern Africa, over 1,000 people per million, North Africa, nearly 600 people per million. And then again, as you go down, the larger the informal economy, on the whole, the lower the death rate. And West Africa is the one that stands out the most there, with an average of 87% of people working informally outside of agriculture, but only 85 COVID deaths per million. So this inverse relationship between the size of the informal economy and the death rate from COVID obtains. And even though, as I've said, it's understood that testing and statistical monitoring of cases and deaths in Africa has been weaker than perhaps other parts of the world, the fact is that the death rate in Africa has been much lower. Many people felt that the death rate in Africa would be very high. The WHO predicted 180,000 by the end of 2020. Bill Gates predicted 10 million deaths by the end of 2020. But in fact, by the end of 2020, there were about 65,000 deaths across the whole of the continent. And many people living in African countries are very aware that the impact of COVID has been quite limited outside of Southern Africa and North Africa. Okay, so why has this happened? Well, what is the explanation for this inverse relationship between the size of the informal economy and COVID deaths? Well, there are many factors. Many people know younger populations, the very swift response of African countries to COVID coming into their countries, and well-developed tracking systems for disease isolation and prevention. But there are elements to do with the informal economy that are quite critical here. And certainly the idea that large informal economies are associated with a high level of vulnerability to COVID is challenged by the statistics on the difference, the inverse relationship between the size of the informal economy and the vulnerability to COVID deaths. Thandika has highlighted the ways in which the history of state development within Africa and the history of the informal economy really shapes very divergent patterns of informality in Africa that can help us understand why this inverse relationship between the size of the informal economy and COVID deaths may arise. For one thing, from my own work, I've seen that even in pre-colonial times, in West Africa, the high proportion of pre-colonial states led to very complex economies arising. They were the formal economies of the day, but with the rise of the colonial state, the imposition of colonial states, those sophisticated networks became informal economies. They didn't disappear; they remained sophisticated networks, but they operated much more under the radar of the state. In Southern Africa and East and Central Africa as well, the density of pre-colonial states was somewhat lower. Economic systems, there were some sophisticated economic systems, but slightly lower density, maybe a bit on the coast of East Africa, at the coast of Southern Africa, but much less densely elaborated than in West Africa. But Thandika also brought to front and center in his article the ways in which the specific character of colonial states reinforced and reshaped the nature of informal economies. And he highlighted Samir Amin's typology of cash crop economies, which are largely concentrated in West Africa, which very much involved a kind of laissez-faire relationship between the state and the informal economy. The state left ordinary African actors to go about their business as long as they delivered the cash crops that were required by the state. Their capacity to bureaucratically engage with and monitor the population simply was not central to the development of West African or cash crop colonial states. In labor reserve states, largely concentrated in Southern Africa, the state was very much focused on monitoring and controlling labor, and as a result, criminalized and suppressed all forms of alternative economic activity that would compete with the mines and the large-scale farms for labor. And that led to much more bureaucratic states, much more capable of controlling and monitoring populations, also in creating welfare systems for the settler populations, and much smaller informal economies. And then Thandika highlights the concession economies, which were much more interventionist as well with regard to the population, but also much more brutal. And he points out that this history led to contemporary differences in the size of informal economies. And he looked at the size, the variation in size with statistics from the 1980s and 90s, in which he found that cash crop economies had an average size of informal economies of 58% of the non-agricultural labor force. Concession economies had informal economies amounting to 49% of the non-agricultural labor force. And labor reserve economies had informal economies that only amounted to 19% of the non-agricultural labor force. So informal economies and cash crop, colonial cash crop economies were much larger and much smaller than labor reserve economies. Now, as I've hinted there, the flip side of small informal economies is stronger state capacity. And Thandika pointed out the need of labor reserve economies to monitor populations, to control population movements, to carry out welfare activities. And in cash crop economies, the weaker levels of bureaucratic capacity and a reliance on mercantile forms of control, indirect engagement.
I think we lost Kate. Kate, you were disconnected for a while, so.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm pointing out that informal economies in sub-Saharan Africa are of different sizes, that colonial cash crop economies had much larger informal economies, and colonial labor reserve economies had much smaller informal economies. And under structural adjustment and globalization, informal economies have expanded, but in ways that have reinforced these divergences. So in West Africa, if we look at the way that structural adjustment and globalization has affected the character and size of the informal economies, they have expanded in a much more sophisticated and diverse way, with a diversity of skills, great absorption of technical skills, and very sophisticated entrepreneurial networks. In former labor reserve economies, you have a much higher concentration of survivalist activities and informal wage labor, governed by a significant density of networks of labor brokers. So if we look at this statistically, we can see that in West Africa, where informal employment amounts to 87% of the non-agricultural labor force, in Southern Africa, only 36%. So informal economies have grown, but much more in West Africa, where the former cash crop economies are concentrated, much more in Southern Africa. But the composition of the informal economy between those two regions is also highly significant. West African informal economies are dominated by informal self-employment, which make up about 2/3 of the informal economy, and only about 1/3 is dependent informal wage labor and family labor. In Southern Africa, the vast majority of the informal economy is dependent informal wage labor and family labor, and only about 22%, less than barely a quarter, are informally self-employed. And that means that the autonomy of the informal economy in Southern Africa is much weaker. They're much more dependent on the employers employing for informal workers to work. Whereas in West Africa, There are autonomous self-employed actors that can carry on their activities, perhaps in the context of evading lockdowns. So what does this have to do with COVID and contagion? The core issue is, if we look at the way that the response to COVID was carried out in Southern and West Africa, we can see really important differences. On the one hand, Southern Africa, with its smaller informal economies, had much more stringent lockdowns. South Africa and Lesotho had national lockdowns. It's the only part of Africa that actually was able to carry off a national lockdown, and very, very stringent and strictly enforced. They had a very strong social protection response, which reached 30 to 50% of the population in Southern Africa with at least one benefit. And yet they had the worst COVID outbreak, the worst impact from COVID. In West Africa, there are very large informal economies, but a very patchy imposition of lockdowns, very quickly carried out, but only in certain regions of the country, were not enforced as strongly in many places, although quite brutally in some places like Kenya and Nigeria. Oh, sorry, like Nigeria. Very limited social protection response that reached only 10 to 15% of the population with at least one benefit. Very little digitization of payments. So if you look at this picture here, the Southern African payment through digital social protection cash transfers. In Nigeria, these social cash transfer payments were often paid physically with tables full of cash handed out. There were generally one-offs in Nigeria, once in March, April, once in November, December. So very low capacity to respond to COVID relative to Southern Africa, but also a very low COVID outbreak. Now, the question is why, if Southern Africa followed such effective COVID response with a strong lockdown and a strong social protection response, why were outcomes so much worse? And the issue here is the appropriateness of the response to the nature of the economy. The lockdowns, as many people have pointed out, are very inappropriate to crowded settlements. They crowd people into small territories where they are unable to engage in social distancing or hand washing. But the digital social protection response as well crowded people at pay points at particular times of the month, and then crowded them into formal supermarkets because many of the food vendors were forbidden to operate. The open markets were locked down. They're controlled by the state. And there is a highly dependent informal economy, which is dominated by wage labor who were unable to work because their employers were not working. So there was very little scope for informal actors to go about their business. In West Africa, you had looser lockdowns, much more diverse social protection mechanisms to roll out relief, communal targeting rather than just digital targeting, the use of associations to disseminate social protection, utility payment waivers. These are all geographical targeting. These are all forms of accessing the population that are much less administratively demanding, so that the state was more able to carry them out. But also the fact that markets remained open, although operating at various times, informal markets. Street vendors continued to operate for much of the time, even under lockdowns. And this reduced congestion and allowed many informal actors to get some income, although income was reduced and constrained. People were getting much more income through informal activities than they would have got through social protection measures. So people were able to get by, to manage. Now, another thing to observe from this is, in the African context, digital social protection is very much not a silver bullet. It's prone to failure in a situation where digital infrastructure is variable at best. It's also prone to delays because the digitization of social is extremely complex, and it is very easily subject to corruption. In fact, equally subject to corruption to physical handing out of cash, as has been demonstrated in both South Africa and Kenya. We can see here two pictures of the rollout of the realities of social protection and informality under COVID. In Southern Africa, you have these intense queues of people getting their social protection benefits, going to supermarkets, getting food handouts. Whereas in West Africa, a lot of people just going about their business, going to the markets, wearing their masks, trying to observe some social distancing in many cases. But the reality is they're out in the open air, not crowded into the settlements, and getting a measure of income. And also people are meeting up at diverse points, diverse markets, street vendors, etc. So the differences, to emphasize what's going on here, the differences in the informal economy reveal divergent state capacity and divergent social policy needs. On the one hand, people who are informally self-employed, they don't need minimalist social policy. They actually were calling for much more support through business loans, enterprise support, etc. Whereas those who are in a dependent labor position may be in need of some kind of social support if their employers are not working. So the question, this evidence really questions the best practice template being celebrated as the solution to addressing the vulnerability of the informal economy under COVID, the idea of expanded basic income support, digital transfers and digital social registers, and a rolling out of social protection on an individual basis. One wonders I think it's important to look at who is pushing this and for what reasons. If one looks at West Africa, we can see that informal economies with a higher share of self-employment and the self-employed in Southern Africa need enterprise support administratively, and the states require administratively simpler targeting and distribution systems for rolling out social protection. They're not necessarily in a position to create these very complex digital social registers and transfer systems. These take an enormous amount of money and digital investment and time. And the question is whether these are appropriate technologies and appropriate administrative mechanisms for creating social protection, and whether this provides the best type of social protection and social policy for the informal economy, even in a COVID context. So I think that the bottom line is the idea that transformative social policy responses to widespread informality really need to engage with the institutional realities of African countries, which vary even among African countries, and to engage with the productive needs of informal actors, not simply to kind of keep them on a digital food line, which really doesn't offer future possibilities for economic development and transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. You know, it is always kind of risky and dangerous to present something about ongoing situations, but I think this is very much bold and brave presentation about COVID-19 and its implication for social policy. Thank you very much. And now we have 4 excellent presentations. I will open the floor. I cannot see any questions in chat though. So if you have any questions or comments, please indicate by pushing the kind of a raise hand button at the bottom of this Zoom platform. No questions, comments? Then maybe I can capitalize on my position as a moderator. I have one question for Kate. You know, when I had a discussion with my friends in Guinea, I asked him about the situation, of COVID-19 there, and he told me that, COVID-19 is nothing here in Guinea. Marburg virus is much more serious. And then there was a report by WHO that the malaria death dwarfed the COVID-19 death in Africa, because it's a kind of ongoing problems. And I wonder whether you checked those deaths, which can be related to informality and the kind of social policy and political economy situations in Africa. So that is my first question. And do we have any other questions? If there's not, maybe we can, okay, we have question from Jochi. Jochi, floor is yours.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. I have a question for Kate, and thank you for that provocative presentation, which really set me thinking a lot. I wondered though why you use the death rate as the measure of comparing the effects of COVID on various Africa's various regions. I was thinking that hunger and the loss of employment or the disruption of employment would have been useful as well, because people have said often that the point about COVID in Africa is not about infections and deaths, that it's much more about the loss of livelihoods, the disruption of livelihoods, and the immiseration of people, particularly people who work in the informal economy. So to give you a small example of the kinds of disruptions, long-term disruptions that COVID has created in a country like Ghana. Ghana's land borders have been closed since April 2020. And this is really disturbing the agri-food system, because as you know, West Africa has one food system, and food circulates in and out of West African countries without anybody knowing who's bringing what in and who's taking what out. And that informality has been very valuable for food security in West Africa. We have this situation now where the government is happy to open air borders. Anybody can come in, but land borders have remained closed, and a lot of small traders and the agri-food system are really suffering. And this is one of the problems of informal livelihoods, that the state is often oblivious to how things affect them. Secondly, if you look at the support responses around COVID, the social protection things you were mentioning, there I think you are entirely correct when you say that informal operators have not quite benefited from those, and that they've been mostly directed at middle-class households. So the subsidies in services and so on have been enjoyed by households that have electricity and water meters, and people who have to buy their water on a daily basis are not enjoying that at all. So I just wanted to share this and to ask you this question about hunger and the loss of livelihoods.
Thank you very much, Jochi. And we have one question for all the presenters. It is from Laura Mann. And I wonder whether Laura can make question herself. It is not possible?
Let me try and okay, now she
Laura Mann is, yeah. Laura, could you make question yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, I wanted to first say that I thought this was a really good session and I enjoyed all four of them and drew insights from all four of them, so thank you. My question is the kind of common theme across all four was the way that knowledge and policy making is kind of disconnected from empirically grounded kind of context, I guess. And in all four, I think there was a kind of problem of models and frameworks from OECD countries kind of being applied and almost imposed on other contexts. And so I wanted to ask if any of the presenters have any optimism about this changing, and what are the strategic things that researchers might do to tackle and highlight this disconnection?
Thank you very much for your excellent question, Laura. I mean, I think Thandika would have loved this question because he always pointed out OECD bias of social policy research. So maybe we can go to Kate first because you have so many questions and comments. And then we can go to Maureen and Chochi and Jimmy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as you note, this is a deliberately provocative paper, but I think to get us to think a lot more about what is appropriate social policy in a particular context. Your question about disease, I think, is in many ways spot on. The fact is that malaria deaths in Africa are about 400,000 a year. And COVID so far has been about 180,000 in 2 years. So that's about 90,000. So less than a quarter. There are so many other things, TB, diarrheal disease, maternal mortality, all far higher by a factor of 2, 3, 4, far higher than death from COVID. So one asks oneself, why is COVID being made such a priority? Why is it that resources are being devoted to COVID? Why is COVID being used as the frame to determine social policy for the future, involving huge investment in social registers and digital infrastructure, et cetera? Wouldn't it be worth taking a step back and saying, what should be the health priorities of African countries with regard to defining the paradigm of social policy going forward? So that I agree that that's really quite an important thing. It's another case of why are you making the West's problem your problem? And I agree that COVID is an issue and it's a global issue, but so far it's only barely exceeded the number of people that were killed under the Hong Kong flu in 1968-69, which was dealt with completely differently. And about 4 million people died in the Hong Kong flu. And that also was a fairly global pandemic, but we had no lockdowns. So it's worth looking at the history of these pandemics and how they've been dealt with and why it is that we are dealing with this pandemic in such a very individualized, privatized way that does not devote any resources to public health systems in the West and tries to focus more on expansive digital responses. A kind of techno-solutionism. That I think is very much a sign of the times. To Joji's question, also a very challenging question, why the death rate rather than focusing on hunger? I think that is because I think we need to challenge the very idea that lockdown was an important first response, or at least a pervasive lockdown. The standard public health way of dealing with a pandemic, as most African countries know very well, has much more to do with tracking and quarantining systems. When Ebola came, there was no lockdown, and that's a far more serious disease than COVID. TB, AIDS, et cetera, have never been dealt with through a lockdown and are on a statistical level, much more serious. So why is lockdown the approach of choice? I can see why you might want to stop flights into the country over a particular period, but using much smaller track, isolate, and quarantine approaches might be much more effective in the context of a disease that isn't even particularly dangerous for a lot of the people in the country. So that the loss of employment is a product of lockdown. It's not a product of COVID. And other kinds of lighter touch, test and trace using the public health systems, which many African countries actually have very well developed and have continued to fund to some degree, might be a much more effective way of dealing with COVID than this kind of mass lockdown policy, which is terrible for the informal economy and does put them in a different situation. And gets us to think about the ways in which informal actors then respond to these situations. And as we've seen in West Africa, the capacity of the state, or more limited bureaucratic capacity of the state to monitor and enforce directly on the whole population across the country, means that many people kind of went about their business. The eyes of the state are not always upon you. People were out doing their selling, markets were open, etc. The informal economy is so big, the very idea of locking it down is ridiculous. And so the states used more administratively simple ways of trying to contain COVID, which I think ultimately were more effective. It's true there are problems of corruption of state capacity as well, but the fortunate reality is those limitations of the state actually produced a better outcome in West Africa than the much more stringent implementation of lockdown and social protection did in Southern Africa, despite smaller informal economies. And finally, Laura's question, I won't say much, so I can hand it over to others, but yes, I do think that there isn't enough attention paid to the institutional realities of the African context, both within the continent as a whole and at the level of particular countries. And I think job one is look at what's happening. Look at the actual statistics. Look at the relationship between the informal economy and the rates of death to COVID. Very simple things suddenly challenge the templates that are received from the OECD. And then I think also there's a need to kind of connect the dots. Who is pushing these templates? Why are they being pushed? Why is Bill Gates, for example, somebody who's made his money on big tech and particularly on vaccines, so keen for this kind of response? And is this a response that serves the interests of African welfare and African populations? Or are these templates that actually are very much influenced by lobbies and international interests and the interests of big capital in ways that don't necessarily serve the best interests of the countries, African countries in which they're being implemented? And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We have around 8 to 9 minutes, so we need Ubuntu's wisdom to divide this 8 or 9 minutes to 3 speakers or 3 teams. So Maureen and Tausi, you have 4 minutes to respond to that question from Laura.
Thanks. I'm going to bite my tongue and avoid all of the issues around COVID on this one, which I'm finding difficult to think about in the context of what we've been writing about. Tausi, you're very involved in policy work. And really what Laura's question is about is the ways of trying to get, good, particularly normative thinking in the particular case, but also just good empirical work into local contextually based policy. So if you're still there, would you like to just briefly reply to this about how optimistic you are about shifting good local contextual research into good local policy? I just can't work.
Tausi?
Tausi, are you there?
Oh, maybe you have to talk, Maureen. I think you can use Tausi's 2 minutes.
Then, we were writing about someone who spent her life trying to, and unfortunately cut short, trying to get local research into local policy. I think I suppose I don't really feel qualified to reply to this. I think it's very much about African researchers on the ground working with African policymakers, and I think there's a lot of that happening. I think Jimmy's been talking about some of it. I I really hope that Tulsi, I think, is reappearing. I really hope that it's going to be possible to strengthen this. Tulsi, are you back? I said it would be really nice if you answered the question about optimism in terms of getting local research into local policy. Can you unmute yourself? Or Jimmy, can you unmute Tulsi? We can't hear you, Tulsi. Just hang on a minute. Can you unmute yourself?
Ask her to unmute.
You're still mute. Can you unmute yourself?
You have to unmute on your side, Jensen.
Okay.
Yes, I've managed. Sorry, Maureen. Yes, something went wrong with the connection here. So can you come back with a question?
Yeah, the question from Laura was the extent to which you're optimistic about improving the situation of getting local contextually founded research into local policy in your own context, in the context in which people have been talking. I hope that's a fair summary.
Yes, thank you, Maureen. I think what I can say is, when you look at the, health policy research in Tanzania, from the early 90s to now, there is progress, but you can see also the issues, for instance, access to care, provision to care, affordability, to the user fees that have been, put on board. The issues, come 3 decades later. We are almost still facing the same issues up to date. So I think there is a need to rethink and see how can we now put on board these issues that have been reoccurring and really find the solution for them. So I think it's very, very important. So what I see, and I've been working in health policy research for a long time, and the biggest challenge is that you see there is progress to solution, but the challenges are still there for many years. So maybe, in a context like this, to see, how can we make the findings that we get through policy, that we really connect them to the solution.
Thank you very much. To me, the kind of manifestation of the optimism about non-OECD social policy model is this conference, Social Policy in Africa. Social policy is not the monopoly of OECD countries anymore. I mean, all those different approaches to social policies are discussed in different places of the world. Okay, let's go for Jochi.
Thank you very much for the question, Laura. As you well know, Tandika always said one should not be pessimistic or optimistic, but should take the realities into account, try to understand them better, and keep on pushing. And I think that efforts like Jimmy's chair, this conference, huge research agendas like the Gender and Transformative Social Policy in Africa project, old consistent work like what has been done at the level of Codestria, UNRWA's own work, and a huge army of heterodox scholars who've been pushing for a different approach to social policy, means that this is work that we need to continue to do and we need to continue pushing for. But it's important to keep on stressing the importance of having our realities in mind when we think about social policy. I never stop saying that what is the best social policy for an economy that is agrarian, dominated by the informal economy and self-employed people? It definitely would not be only about wages. It is going to be about a much broader range of policies which support all the functions for social policy that have been put forward in the transformative social policy approach. But it's a useful question, and it's something we should keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Jimmy.
Well, yeah, thanks, Laura. I'm not sure. I think Georgie was referring to Tandika's, what you call a rejection of the Afro euphoria. I think Tandika was somebody who was immensely optimistic about the future of Africa, in spite of all the obstacles and difficulties. And we wouldn't be here if we're not. Partly two things. I remember when the social policy in the development context research project started, and I was external, coordinator for Sub-Saharan Africa. That's a UN classification. We reject it on our own side. There's only one Africa, but that's a UN thing. I know among some of other co-coordinators, skepticism about social policy, but you're from Africa. What do you mean social policy? And if you look at our manuscript, we focused on education, healthcare, housing, and so on and so forth. They kind of standard thing. And I remember Oli Kangas, who, along with Joachim Palmer, were responsible for the Nordic study, saying at a conference in Florence that it was when he read our manuscript that suddenly sparked in his mind that education was vital for the Nordic context. Okay, and I think the point about this conference, the point about the chair, is about if we understand social policy as mechanism, instruments, conceptual framework to respond to the social question, then it has to be locally grounded. It has to be conceptually rigorous, and that's why the concept of transformative social policy isn't simply just about Africa, isn't simply just about Asia. I'm particularly, I was intrigued by these debates among our colleagues in Europe who are talking about a transition to social investment welfare state. And I was scratching my head thinking, what do you think the Swedish thing was about if we're talking about social investment? What do you think, education, investment in education was about? What do you think, active labor market policy was about? The LO was very clear. We don't protect the work, we protect the worker. And you start make, instruments and so on and so forth. But final point that I would like to make is this, is that we all need to be encouraged by precisely what we are fighting against, the neoliberal project. Think about Friedrich Hayek in 1943 or 42 in LSE, and the setting up of the Pelerin, Man-Pelerin society, and the length of the time they were in isolation. Again, I've told this story several times. In 1972, somebody returned to Imre Lakato's journal, said the neoliberal something, the Chicago school was not a scientific research program, a valid scientific research program. And Milton Friedman wrote to Imre Lakato's protesting. Imre Lakatos said, okay, I'll give you the next issue of the journal to argue your case. He never came back. Ideas have to conspire with power to become the basis of changing the world. Our responsibility is to stay the course. The idea about this conference as a series is precisely to begin to garner and bring the, not because I'm optimistic that in 5 years' time there will be a change in terrain, but I'm optimistic that in 20 years' time, in 40 years' time, but the ideas have to be available to conspire with power. That's what we do. That's what we must continue to do what we do. That's why in spite of the darkness that envelopes us about the demonic notion about the nature of the state and the nature of the way in which the state thinks about its citizens, we must stay the course. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 70 billion people, 7 billion people in the world, and we can think that we have more than 7 billion personal problems, and we can easily make a guess that we have 193 social agendas of 193 countries. Every country has different social problems and different societal kind of problems and issues. And I think we have social policy to deal with those. We don't have to be confined to kind of certain areas established by, developed countries' experiences, all that, because social policy is a social construct and political construct, depending on the kind of a different context of different countries. So I think, it is not the optimism, it's a kind of fact. The social policy can be evolved to respond to our societal problems. And I thank you, all the speakers and the audience, and we have very good and rich discussions about, how to rethink a social policy and why. Thank you very much. And I have to close this session. And thank you all for your excellent contributions. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having us. Thanks very much indeed for the chairing too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the sharing. Bye-bye. Lovely to see you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.